So Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. So let's just do a couple Thomas Hobbes clips here.
Hobbes goes on, and he points out that this is the law of the gospel. Whatsoever you require others should do to you, you do to them, right? So don't do things that you don't want other people to do to you.
So that's pretty good, right? The law of the gospel. So the law of the gospels is what? The law of the Gospels is the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated. Now, here's this guy. He's saying, talking about Hobbes' state of nature. And essentially, what Hobbes thinks is the state of nature is we're all born evil and without a Leviathan, without a strong hand to govern us, without using our rationality. The state of nature, life is solitary,
according to Hobbes,
poor,
life in the state
nasty,
of nature
brutish, and
is
short.
terrible. Our worst fears are realized in it. Our worst fear is dying prematurely. And what do we find in the state of nature? We die prematurely. Life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That's his famous quote. And we don't want that, right? We don't want to have the solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short lives. So therefore, we need a social contract. And the social contract with the government is they'll do certain things. We'll give up our right to everything, but we get a lot of freedoms in return. So there's like 20 natural laws you could come up with.
Hobbes says that in this law of nature consisteth the fountain and original of justice, where no covenant has preceded, no right has been transferred, and everybody has right to everything. But once we actually have a covenant made, to break it is unjust. And so the definition of injustice is no other than the non-performance of covenant. And whatsoever is not unjust is just. And
so he's saying contracts is the main thing, right? When it comes to what can man figure out for himself, well, you have to maintain your contract. If you don't maintain your contract, well, then that's good. It's going to fuck it all up. That's just going to fuck everything up, man. That's just going to fuck everything up.
Which could encourage people to depose rulers whenever they felt a little unhappy with their lot. Hobbes had received a first-hand account of the beheading of King Charles I on a scaffold in front of the banqueting house of the Palace of Whitehall in 1649, and his intellectual labours were directed at making sure that such ghastly primitive scenes would never be repeated. So, in Leviathan, Hobbes puts forward an ingenious argument.
Okay, so that's just about Hobbes' life. Hobbes came out of the English Civil War, and so his own life is actually pretty remarkable because he's a royalist. But even this royalist says that we have certain freedoms, rights and freedoms. So I just want to talk a little bit about Thomas Hobbes, and actually I want to read some Thomas Hobbes. Why? Because Thomas Hobbes is kind of my great awakening. My God. People have been sitting there trying to tell me freedom isn't a good thing, or freedom's not a value or a virtue that they actually believe in. And when you read Thomas Hobbes and you're just kind of like, well, Jesus Christ, it's all about fucking freedom. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This comes from the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness actually presupposes freedom. It presupposes natural law. Lockean natural law says that a person is born to perfect freedom and therefore perfect power. They get a right to everybody and everything all the time. Now, that's not jungle law. That's not natural law to my understanding of it. That's jungle law. So jungle law is everybody against everybody. Like you just read about how life is short, brutish, nasty, terrible. Everybody's killing each other. I forgot the exact quote, which is awful because we just looked at it. But that famous quote, short, awful, brutish, and short, terrible, nasty. Okay, so Lockean natural law says a person is born to perfect freedom. So that's interesting because if you think about what is just in the realm of natural law, if you have a right to everything, you have a right to everybody and everything all the time, then you have a right to determine what the injury is and what you think that the correct punishment for that injury is. So it could be a tiny little thing, and then you could, take a molehill and make a mountain of it, or you could try to have equal and exact justice. I think equal and exact justice makes a lot of sense to me. Equal, exact, and correct justice. Equal and exact justice. That's Thomas Jefferson. So Hobbes is brilliant because, okay, so here's natural law. Jungle law is this war of everybody against everybody. Natural law is what is rational man. If you put rational man in that jungle, what can rational man come up with? And so this is more of a, I guess, a mythic realm. It's a revolutionary way of thinking. So it's not so much that in the state of nature, back in the Garden of Eden, back when we were cavemen, back when we were, I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying rational man in a jungle, and I want you to use your own reason, your own ability to use logic and rationality, and you figure out what the hell you have a right to. If you are just born and you have perfect freedom and you have perfect power, that means everybody else has perfect freedom and perfect power. That's why jungle law is going to happen, so we all start fighting over each other. But let's just say, let's start using logic, okay? So you put rational man in the jungle. Well, what rights do you have? What rights do you have that you would agree that others have the same rights? We aren't just animals, we are rational men, so we are rational animals. Well, it's all kind of all we got, right, is our ability to acquire knowledge and our ability to think about things. So Hobbes was able to construct this elaborate scheme of natural law. He's got a social contract, right? So the first one is we have a right to self-defense, and then the second one is we have a right to enter into contracts, and then to have those contracts enforced. Well, how are you going to enforce the contracts if you don't have a Leviathan? If somebody just breaks the contract and there's no injury to the thing, well, then they're just going to keep breaking the contract. But if you have a third person, if you have a Leviathan, if you have a strong man that says, hey, you better enforce the contract and you all agreed to this thing, so now you have to do the thing that you agreed to. Well, the only way that you can ensure those kind of contracts will always be enforced is if you have a fair and square, balanced and even-handed judge, a fair judge. So from just those premises, the very first one is we have a right to self-defense, and then the second right, the natural law, these are the rights of rational men. So you got jungle law, right? This is where we're all just killing each other and it's just a big bloody mess, but that's jungle law. Natural law properly defined is rational man in the jungle. So from a right to self-defense, number one, and then a right to enter into contracts and to have those contracts enforced, he elaborates this whole big social contract theory. Not just the first two laws of nature, but we have lots more laws of nature after that. And so it's brilliant. It's all based upon logic. You have a right to self-defense. I have a right to self-defense. You have a right to enter into a contract and have that contract enforced. I have a right to enter into a contract and to have that contract enforced. So from those two laws of nature, Hobbes proceeds to deduce a series of other laws, each one building upon the last in a scientific and geometric and mathematical fashion. So here's Hobbes' 34 laws of nature. They're very simply defined, but that's why I'm going to read them to you later on just so you get exactly Hobbes. Because if you don't have access to the Leviathan, you may forget about these things. And Hobbes has a very particular way of writing, and it seems scientific and smart, but sometimes it's pretty cloggy and cloddy in other spots. So Hobbes' 34 laws of nature is this: the right to peace, the right to self-defense, the right to contracts, the right to a social contract, the rights to rights itself, the right to justice and accommodation, the right to impartial mediators and arbitrators without self-interest or conflicts of interest, the right to distributive justice, equality in judgment, the right to judgments based upon facts and witnesses, the right to complaisance. Well, what's these words even mean? Complaisance, C-O-M-P-L-A-I-S-A-N-C-E, the right to pardon, the right to mercy, the right to error, the right to locomotion, indoors and out, the right to water and fire, the right to bodily autonomy, the right of lot and commons used equally by all, of lot, first seizure, primogeniture, and by drawing straws, lottery. Well, wait a second. Let's go back to the right to air. Well, of course, you don't have air, you can't breathe. The right to water, again, you don't have life without water. And he doesn't just say the right to some of these basic things, but he's saying you have a right to all those things which make life worth living. So right to fire, water, bodily autonomy, so freedom, locomotion, you could actually move and run around. And punishments are for justice, not revenge. gratitude, equity, right of free passage for peacemakers, and freedom from exception of persons, iniquity, hatred, contempt, pride, arrogance, and contumely. And he says the reason why his laws hold up is because good is always going to be good no matter what. Bad is always going to be bad. It's always good to have gratitude. It's always going to be good for equity. It's always going to be good to pursue justice, but not revenge. He says to think of the future in front of you, but don't, dwell too much on the past. So when you decide what the punishment's going to be, make sure you're deciding it for the future and not so much what the past dictates. Punishments are for justice, revenge, not revenge. So we have a right to good things, right? We have a right to good things. We have a right to self-defense. We have a right to contracts, and we'll always have a right to those things. But we have a freedom from exception of persons, which is his own definition of things. But iniquity, that's wickedness, hatred, contempt. These are always going to be things that causes conflict and war. Pride, arrogance, and contumely. Contumely. I was just thinking of contumely the other day. Contumely is this. Anytime people just talk down to you or insult you, people talk with a hate-filled tone, or they talk about you contemptuously. They're sitting there whispering at you, pointing and laughing and just being a piece of shit. Well, that goes against the state of nature. And then he says, if you go against the state of nature, properly defined, then you are starting a war. You are starting a war. Those who are not consistent with the state of nature are starting a war. So it's almost just like common sense. Common sense with rationality, with logic, which you can figure out on your own in the privacy of your own home. When you think about solitary man in a jungle, and then you try to put solitary man in a jungle with other solitary men, how does that all work out? So I think that's pretty remarkable. We're able to think of 34 laws of nature. Natural law is not the law of the jungle, so I just want to make sure that's crystal clear. Natural law is not the law of the jungle. Okay, I think we're hitting it all pretty good here. Let's carry on. Jungle law is the law of the animals. Natural law is the law of rational man in the jungle. Jean-Jacques Burlamaqui, he wrote in the Principles of Natural Law that perfect rights are those which may be asserted in rigor, even by employing force to obtain the execution or to secure the exercise thereof in opposition to all those who should attempt to resist or disturb us. Thus reason would empower us to use force against anyone who would make an unjust attack on our lives, our goods, or our liberty. And when you think about what is natural law, that's natural law. Life, liberty, and property. It's easier to, they all agree with that. I would say almost kind of across the board. It's Locke. Locke agrees with that. So does this Burlamaqui. So does Hobbes. You got a right to life, you have a right to liberty, and you have a right to property. So if anybody tries to attack any of those things, then you have a right to defend your life, your liberty, or your goods with rigor. Madison, who was a Federalist, he's the one who wrote the Bill of Rights. More of it as an afterthought. The genius of Madison is that he enshrined natural law into constitutional law. This is after he got America to consent to the Constitution without it. So the individual freedoms was an afterthought, but it was a necessary afterthought because it was saying, well, this Constitution is pretty good. You got the 3 branches of government and this and that and the other. But you forgot a really big thing. All these other states have all these individual freedoms, and you forgot to mention the individual freedoms. So now I'm going to read, this is Leviathan, and this is chapter 14 of the first and second natural laws and of contract. So, and consequently, so let's see, endureth, there can be no security of man. Let's just get to the sentence there. And therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endureth, there could be no security to any man, how strong or wise soever he be, living out of the time which nature ordinarily alloweth men to live. And consequently, it's a precept or a general rule of reason that every man ought to endeavor peace, as far as he has hope of obtaining it. And when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. The first branch of which rule containeth the fundamental law of nature, which is to seek peace and follow it. The second, the sum of the right of nature, which is by all means we can to defend ourselves. From this fundamental law of nature, by which men are commanded to endeavor peace, is derived this second law. that a man be willing when others are so too, as far forth as for peace and defense of himself, he shall think it necessary to lay down this right to all things, and be contented with so much liberty against other men as he would allow other men against himself. So that's not just the right to contract, that's the right to the social contract. And so because of those first two laws, we're going to construct this elaborate sort of scheme of rational laws that man in a jungle could figure out himself. So before we did this, it was just jungle law, right? Everybody against everybody. But now we're starting to become rational men. We're starting to become men who believe that we have a right to freedom. There is a thing called rights, and therefore what I have a right to, you have a right to as well. So the first one is self-defense. The first one is you got to endeavor peace. You got to pursue peace for as far as you can pursue it and as best as you can. But when you can't, when you can no longer pursue peace, then you may war. You may seek and use all helps and advantages of war, i.e. self-defense. You have a right to defend yourself. And then he says, because we just came from the law of the jungle, well, you used to have a right to everything. Now you're telling me that your rights are my rights? No, I get all the rights and you get no rights because you have a right to everybody, right? You have a right to even the person's body. You have a right to all things, all the property of the world, and everybody in this world. Well, that's going to be a terrible ending because that's going to lead to, brutish, short, nasty, terrible, right? Just a war of all versus all. So, let's see here. For that were to expose himself to prey, which no man is bound to, rather than to dispose himself to peace. That is the law of the gospel. Whatsoever you require that others should do to you, that do ye to them, and that law of all men, quod tibi fieri non vis, alteri ne feceris. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That's my God, why have you forsaken me in Aramaic? So, all right, we got the first law, the right to self-defense. The second law, the right to social contract. If you give up the right to everything and everybody all the time, I'll give up my right to everybody and everything all the time. You give up the right to everything, I give up my right to everything. Now we're entering into a social contract. Why would we do this? Because by deciding what rights I have and what rights you have, whatever rights I have are the same rights you have, and therefore we have as much freedom as we want until it infringes upon your freedom. My right expands as big as your rights do. So by thinking about this, we can easily get to a point of figuring out, who we are and what the hell we're doing on this planet. The mutual transferring of right is that which men call contract. Then he goes on and on, talks about how important it is to maintain your contract. If you don't maintain your contract, that's justice and injustice, as you heard that one guy say. So to him, justice isn't, eye for an eye or whatever. It's, you didn't fulfill your contract, you're a rat bastard. Fuck, I get to kick you in the dick. Nope. You said I get that for $5. I gave you $5 and you didn't give me that apple. Now I get to kick you in the dick. So now we're going to go to chapter 15 of other laws of nature, and we're going to talk about the third and fourth and fifth laws of nature. This is just building upon the first two. You have a right to self-defense, you have a right to social contracts, you also have a right to contract itself. From that law of nature by which we are obliged to transfer to another, such rights as being retained hinder the peace of mankind. There followeth the third, which is this, that men perform their covenants made. Okay, so this means you have to abide by your personal contracts. We got a social contract, right? We're all giving up our right to everything so we can have this list of rights that we're constructing right now. And so two rights we have, right to social contract, right to contracts, and a right to self-defense. That men perform their covenants made, without which covenants are in vain, but empty words, and the right of all men to all things remaining, we are still in the condition of war. That's true. So if we're in the jungle and we just made an agreement, all right, I'll give you $5, you give me that apple, I gave you $5, and you didn't give me no fucking apple, you fucking motherfucker. Now we're in a state of war. Now it's going to be the all versus all. So you just broke all of society down because you didn't fulfill your contract. And in this law of nature consisteth the fountain and original of justice. Let's go to the fourth. Justice not contrary to reason. We're going to find the fourth law of nature here soon. I'm skipping pages, okay? So this comes from chapter 14 and 15, but I'm just on the side. It says the fourth law of nature, gratitude. Now, how's gratitude a law? It means you say thanks, right? If somebody does something for you, you say thank you. As justice dependeth on antecedent covenant. Antecedent is prior to, right? Antecedent. That's what it seems like if you break the word up. A thing or event that existed before or logically precedes another, right? Preceding in time or order, previously or pre-existing. So, as justice depended on antecedent covenant, so does gratitude depend on antecedent grace. And what is grace? Let's take a look at that definition. Grace is simple elegance or refinement of movement, right? She moved through the water with effortless grace. That's not really, at least he has the grace to admit his debt to her. So that's courteous, goodwill. There's actually, I just looked at the definitions from this dictionary, and there's a whole bunch of different definitions. Let's take a look at these definitions. If we're not using words with the same definitions, we're not actually communicating now, are we? So let's take a look at what grace means in the English language. There's usually a whole bunch of different ways you could think about it, right? Like you just heard, graceful or courteous and goodwill. So that's usually what I think about. Just it's good if somebody says through grace. You know, somebody said that we can actually figure out the mind of God. Thomas Aquinas says we can't figure out the mind of God. Eternal law, we can't figure out divine law. We can only figure out eternal law. Why? Because we cannot know the mind of God. The great spirit of ultimate goodness, the Father up in heaven, God, we cannot understand what he actually thinks, what he truly thinks. That's why, sometimes we'll say, well, God's way is a mystery, it's just a mystery. And in a way, that's kind of true. But with grace, we probably could get close to what the mind of God would think. When Jesus talks about the parable of the seed, I remember when I read the 10 Commandments, I just ate that shit up when I read about, justice being eye for an eye, or when I read about the golden rule, we should treat others the way we want to be treated. I just swallowed that hook, line, and sinker because, well, shit, it fucking made sense. So I was very much fertile ground for the words of wisdom that Jesus was casting out. He wasn't casting those pearls out before swine. He was casting those pearls out to diamonds, to revolutionaries, to other Jesuses. So grace, what is grace here? We have a couple things for what grace is, like 12 definitions, right? Are you ready? Actually 13, 14. Honor, adorn, embellish. Let's go to the main one. So unmerited help given to people by God, as in overcoming temptation. Freedom from sin through divine grace. A virtue coming from God. So grace, God can help you get to God's mind. That's what the guy was telling me, that you could figure out the mind of God with grace. So with God's help, you could figure out the thinking of God. So not only can we figure out eternal law, according to this guy that was just posting on the internet about St. Thomas Aquinas, not only can we figure out eternal law, but we can figure out divine law as well. A virtue coming from God, used as a title for a duke, duchess, or archbishop. A short prayer at a meal. A temporary respite as from the payment of a debt. Approval, acceptance in his good graces, right? If you approve of somebody, you're in their good graces. Charm, attractiveness, beauty, fitness, or proportion of line or expression, ease of movement, musical trill or ornament. And then honor, adorn, embellish. Okay, so that's some definitions of grace. We got 6 or 7 minutes. Can we get through all these definitions? Let's try to, okay? So, a man in which receiveth benefit from another. Okay, let's see. As justice dependent on antecedent covenant, so does gratitude depend on antecedent grace. That is to say, antecedent free gift, and is the fourth law of nature, which may be conceived in this form, that a man which receiveth benefit from another of mere grace endeavor that he which giveth it have no reasonable cause to repent him of his good will. So it's not just saying thank you. But if somebody comes by and they give you a gift, maybe they're giving you a gift of a turkey because they want to see your house or some shit. Maybe they got ulterior motives. But he's saying you can't do that. You can't do that. Somebody comes over there and gives you a turkey, you got to say thank you for their turkey. For no man giveth but with intention of good to himself, because gift is voluntary, and of all voluntary acts the object is to every man his own good, of which if men see they shall be frustrated, there would be no beginning of benevolence or trust, nor consequently of mutual help, nor of reconciliation of one man to another, and therefore they're to remain still in the condition of war, which is contrary to the first and fundamental law of nature, which commandeth men to seek peace. The breach of this law is called ingratitude, and hath the same relation to grace that injustice hath to obligation by covenant. So there, I think that's self-explanatory. A fifth law of nature is complaisance. I just mentioned this, and actually it looks like I misspelled complaisance. Complaisance. C-O-M-P-L-E-A-S-A-N-C-E. That is to say that every man strive to accommodate himself to the rest, for the understanding whereof we may consider that there is in men's aptness to society a diversity of nature arising from their diversity of affections, not unlike to that we see in stones brought together for building of an edifice. For as that stone, which by the asperity and irregularity of figure takes more room from others than itself fills, and for the hardness cannot be easily made plain, and thereby hindereth the building, is by the builders cast away as unprofitable and troublesome. So also, a man that by asperity of nature will strive to retain those things which to himself are superfluous, and to others necessary, and for the stubbornness of his passions cannot be corrected, is to be left or cast out of society as cumbersome thereunto. For seeing every man not only by right, but also by necessity of nature, is supposed to endeavor all he can to obtain that which is necessary for his conservation. So, in a way, it just sounds like that every man strive to accommodate himself to the rest. I heard a better, actually, way of Emerson. He says, if you want to participate in society, then you have to give to society. You want to be a friend? If you want to have a friend, you got to be a friend. If you want to be in society, then you have to give to society. You could take from society, you could take from the friendship, but you got to give back to society, and you got to give back to the friendship. So he is saying all those things. And so, foreseeing every man, not only by right, but also by necessity of nature, is supposed to endeavor all he can to obtain that which is necessary for his conservation, he that shall oppose himself against it for things superfluous is guilty of the war that thereupon is to follow, and therefore doth an act which is contrary to the fundamental law of nature, which commandeth to seek peace. The observers of this law may be called sociable. The Latins called them commodi. The contrary, stubborn, insociable, froward, and intractable. The sixth law of nature is this, that upon caution of future time, a man ought to pardon the offenses past of them that repenting desire it. For pardon is nothing but granting of peace, which though granted to them that persevere in their hostility, be not peace but fear, yet not granted to them that give caution of the future time, as sign of an aversion to peace, and therefore contrary to the law of nature. So, if the thing calls for it to give mercy, to pardon the thing, then you should do the thing. You should pardon the thing. A seventh is that in revenges, that is retribution of evil for evil, men look not at the greatness of the evil past, but the greatness of the good to follow. So this is justice, not revenge, whereby we are forbidden to inflict punishment with any other design than for correction of the offender or direction of others. For this law is consequent to the next before it, that commandeth pardon upon security of the future time. Besides, revenge without respect to the example and profit to come is a triumph, or glorying in the hurt of another, tending to no end. For the end is always somewhat to come, and glorying to no end is vain glory and contrary to reason. And to hurt without reason tendeth to the introduction of war, which is against the law of nature, and is commonly styled by the name of cruelty. So don't be fucking cruel. Don't be cruel to a heart that's true. Don't be cruel to a heart that's true. That is so fucking right. So when revenge is punishment, retribution of evil for evil, you can, defend yourself. You can use violence to, for the contract thing, right? If you didn't do the apple, I paid you $5, you didn't give me an apple, and I'm trying to get the apple from you, but I'm not able to force, you to give me the apple, then I have to go get the Leviathan. Then me and the Leviathan's going to get that damn apple from you, or it's just going to be freaking war. Once I get the apple, then okay, I paid you, or get my money back at least, and then a little bit, then some, for making me go through all this shit. You could have just gave me the fucking apple. Instead, you had to fucking declare war on me. And because all signs of hatred or contempt provoke to fight, the 8th, this is against contumely. I'm not for sure if I'm going to be able to get through all this one. I think I'll just do one more or two more and then come back to all this, because this is just really important, and I want to make sure I get all the words that are surrounded by each one of these laws of nature, so that way for anybody who doesn't read or can't read or doesn't have the book Leviathan or doesn't have, I guess if you got the internet you could just get it, but there's something about saying it out loud too that makes it more real. And because all signs of hatred or contempt provoke to fight, again, all signs of hatred or contempt. And I once heard that like contempt is worse than hatred. So it's all love. It's all love. As soon as you have a sign of hatred or a sign of contempt, that's going to provoke to fight. Now we're in a war. Insomuch as most men choose rather to hazard their life than not to be revenged, we may in the 8th place for a law of nature set down this precept, that no man by deed, word, countenance, or gesture declare hatred or contempt of another, the breach of which law is commonly called contumely. Also, the breach of it is contumely. So you don't want to be contumely, you contumely fuck. What are you being so contumely for? And then he actually explains this later on, and this is going to suck because I don't have all the explanation, but he was just kind of saying that there's two kinds of injuries, or there's two kinds of injustice. He was saying that you could, by showing hatred and contempt, you are showing that you are willing to commit crimes. You are willing to injure the other person. By showing hatred and contempt, you are showing that you haven't injured them yet, but by saying you are willing to injure them, or that you may injure them, well then that's going to be against the law of nature as well. So that no man by word, deed, countenance, or gesture declare hatred or contempt of another, the breach of which law is commonly called contumely. This makes me think of the Chaplinsky decision. So the cop is going to arrest Chaplinsky because he was protesting. He's a Jehovah's Witness, and he was saying, the kingdom of God is coming. And that pissed some people off, and they were getting all pissed off at him. The cop goes along with the crowd, and as he arrests Chaplinsky, he's taking him to jail. Chaplinsky says, "Hey, you damn fascist." And then the guy, throws him down on the ground. So, are you allowed to throw somebody down on the ground for their words or speech? Don't we have freedom of speech in this country? And the Supreme Court says yes. There's actually a thing called fighting words. There's a concept called fighting words. So if somebody says some shit that you don't like, and this goes to this, contumely. If you're being contumely, you show some hatred, you show some contempt. I hate the Chaplinsky decision because the guy's already grabbing him, so he's being a fascist, authoritarian fascist fuck. And by grabbing him and, whisking him off to jail, you can't get more fucking fascist than that. So he's basically calling a fascist a fascist. And then it's like, well, hey, you're not allowed to do that. No, I am allowed to do that. If anything, the Chaplinsky was saying that he was willing to maybe do injury, but just with his words, whereas the other guy was actually causing injury by kidnapping him, putting his hands on the other guy, and, taking him, and the breach. Let's see. The question of who's the better man has no place in the condition of mere nature, whereas has been shown before, all men are equal. The inequality that now is has been introduced by the law of civil. I know that Aristotle, in the first book of his Politics, for a foundation of his doctrine, maketh men by nature some more worthy to command, meaning the wiser sort, such as he thought himself to be for his philosophy, others to serve, meaning those that had strong bodies, but were not philosophers as he, as if master and servant were not introduced by consent of men, but by difference of wit, which is not only against reason, but also against experience. For there are very few foolish, there are very few so foolish that had not rather governed themselves than be governed by others. Nor when the wise in their own conceit contend by force with them who distrust their own wisdom, do they always or often or almost at any time get the victory. If nature therefore have made men equal, that equality is to be acknowledged, or if nature have made men unequal, yet because men that think themselves equal will not enter into conditions of peace, but upon equal terms, such equality must be admitted, and therefore for the ninth law of nature I put this, that every man acknowledge other for his equal by nature. The breach of this precept is pride. And then, have we not heard that before? That all men are created equal? So we'll come back to this. This has ran over 30 minutes, so